Could war in Iraq have been averted? A British inquiry concludes the 2003 invasion went badly wrong and Iraqis are still living with the consequences. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair is accused of going to war on flawed intelligence over supposed weapons of mass destruction. So could the blunder happen again? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine. Now, a coalition of US and British troops invaded Iraq on the 20th of March 2003. They fought to overthrow Saddam Hussein, based largely on a claim that he possessed weapons of mass destruction. Those weapons were never found, and the war that followed is estimated to have killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, unleashed 13 years of sectarian violence, and destroyed Iraq's institutions and infrastructure. For the past 7 years, a British inquiry has been investigating the events that led up to the invasion and what lessons should be learned. The chairman of the inquiry, Sir John Chilcot, has delivered a damning indictment of British policy. He says claims made about the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction were not substantiated and were presented with a certainty that was unjustified. Despite explicit warnings, Chilcot says, the consequences of an invasion were underestimated by the government and that planning and preparation for a post-invasion Iraq was, in his words, wholly inadequate. Chilcot also questioned the legal basis for going to war, saying it was far from satisfactory. All right, let's get a sample now of what Tony Blair and George Bush told the public in the run-up to the invasion.
The policy of containment is not working. The weapons of mass destruction program is not shut down. It is up and running now. It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them, that he has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes, including against his own Shia population, and that he is actively trying to acquire nuclear weapons capability.
The dictator of Iraq is not disarming. To the contrary, he is deceiving. Evidence from intelligence sources, secret communications, and statements by people now in custody reveal that Saddam Hussein aids and protects terrorists, including members of Al-Qaeda. Secretly and without fingerprints, he could provide one of his hidden weapons to terrorists or help them develop their own.
All right, let's introduce our guests now. In London, we have Nafeez Ahmed, columnist for the Middle East Eye. In Manchester, Piers Robinson, senior lecturer in international politics at the University of Manchester. And also in London, we have Frank Ledwidge, senior fellow at the Royal Air Force College at the University of Portsmouth. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. But Frank, can I start with you, because you were actually in Iraq for some time. After waiting 7 years for this tome of work to be released, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's couched in civil service speak and it's rather polite. However, I think it sets a positive tone. A lot of people, I think, are tempted to see this as an end in itself, and those people are mistaken. This should be seen as a foundation for future action, whether that action may take the form of legal or administrative or some other consequence. The blunders of 2003 and 2004, not only political, I mean, you had Blair and Bush on there, but military, the incompetence,
indeed,
the lack of strategic thinking.
You were actually on the ground in Iraq, weren't you, leading a team on a specific mission looking for WMD, which, of course, never materialised.
That's right, and it was pretty clear after a couple of weeks on the ground in September 2003, when I got there with my team, that there was nothing to be found. And furthermore, when we inquired of our seniors and betters whether there might be any programmes down where we were in the south of Iraq, my team, they basically laughed at us and said, what the hell are you doing down there?
And does that make you feel quite bitter then with this report?
Well, no, not really. It was a waste of my time, but that's not important. Most of my team, in fact, all of my team, got back in one big bit. Of course, a lot of people didn't. Hundreds of British and thousands of Americans were killed, but I think rather more importantly, hundreds of thousands of the people who were supposed to be there to help were killed, and millions, as everyone knows, I think, particularly in this audience, millions displaced. Now, does the report give justice to those? Well, in its own little way, I think it does, but it must be seen as a foundation for future for accountability,
right? Okay.
Rather than accountability in itself.
Nafeez, now you'd earlier expected that this report would be pretty insubstantial. What's your opinion of it now it's been released?
Well, I think after waiting for this report for so long, there's been a huge amount of money put into it. It's, you know, longer than the collective works of Shakespeare, we're told. And unfortunately, while the findings so far are indeed damning, and it's important that we've got this far, and it is important that we have an official government inquiry stating these conclusions and giving them the official authority of the government, the reality is that these facts have been known to journalists and historians of the war for many years and are very well documented. So in reality, the inquiry hasn't really brought forward the debate on the war. It's merely restated many things we already know. And all of these facts that are being stated now about the war having been planned in advance, the lack of planning for the aftermath of the war inside Iraq, all of these things are very, very well known, very, very well documented. They've been brought up time and time again. I think the real question is, and I would agree with Frank in this respect, is what is the consequence of these facts? What is going to be done to hold government to account for these horrifying failures? And more than that, the biggest omission, I would say, of this report is that this is not just a case of blunders. There were deliberate decisions that were made. And in fact, this report has gone out of its way to put forward the framing that much of what has been done has been a mistake, it's been tragic, but there was, to some extent, a kind of underlying benevolence in our reasons for going to Iraq. And what I think many historians have actually documented from some of the same source material that Sir John Chilcot has been looking at, including even the witnesses that he's interviewed, is that in reality that's not the case. There were pre-made decisions to go to war which were not about benevolence, but were very self-serving.
Okay, all right, but we, to be fair, I'm sure none of us have actually waded through this epic piece of work. Piers, can I come to you, because I'm particularly interested in the style of government which has come in for quite a bit of criticism. It was described at the time, if you remember, as a kind of sofa-style government that Tony Blair ran, and that has come in for some significant criticism, hasn't it, in the report?
Yes, absolutely. I'd start by saying I agree with Frank and Nafeez that on both of their points that in one sense we've heard all of this before, or we know all of this, but at the same time Chilcot is delivering more information into the public domain, and Frank's absolutely right. It is an opportunity to move forward and to try and learn lessons and to make sure these things don't happen again. So I think it's absolutely critical at this point in time, when you have a report of this nature delivering the criticisms that it's delivering, that there then becomes something meaningful, a real political will to actually learn lessons and to move forward. I'm not totally confident that will actually occur. Picking up on your point about sofa government, absolutely, Blair has been criticised, and one of the damning criticisms coming from Chilcot is that really the decisions were being made without due diligence, that Blair wasn't including sufficient numbers of advisors and so on in order to get the right decisions, etc. And that's quite clearly a problem. But Nafeez is absolutely right. This disguises somewhat a bigger picture, is that when we talk about errors of government, sofa government, mistakes and so on, we're sort of buying into a narrative which understands this as policy mistakes, when in fact this was an outcome, or the Iraq invasion was the outcome of a very deliberate strategy which you can trace it back to the 1990s. It was rooted in the neoconservative movement, and many motivations and many reasons for going to war really lay in areas far, far away from weapons of mass destruction. This was
what do you mean?
War for power and influence.
I was going to say, I mean, what do you mean that the decision to go to war was rooted in the 1990s? Can you explain that a bit more?
Well, absolutely. The neoconservatives and had passed, a law had been passed in America in the 1990s that the removal of Saddam Hussein was official American policy. It was something which, for a number of reasons, was seen as in the US interest to carry out that policy. And all of the sort of debate and argument about weapons of mass destruction and the UN route were really the way of promoting and pulling on or building a coalition to support the invasion of Iraq.
All right.
So this is a war, this is a geostrategic war, and I think that gets lost in a lot of these discussions about failure and mistakes.
All right, I
being
understand
made.
your point now. Frank, coming to you. So Piers has highlighted the rise of the neocons in the United States, but what about the flawed intelligence that Chilcot points out? I mean, he's talking about there being flawed intelligence, less than robust analysis, and then misrepresentation of the intelligence.
Yes, well, the term that comes to mind, and which was litigated at great length in 2004, actually when I was in Iraq, bizarrely enough, was sexed up. And sexed up for quite a while was a toxic and a toxic comment that almost resulted in the BBC, to refer to another broadcasting agency, being well, it did result in their being seriously disciplined. But sexed up is what the intelligence was. The purpose of intelligence is to provide objective information, a basis upon which decisions should be made. It should not be seen as an adversarial tool of advocacy, of narrative building, which is what it was. And I think it was the Downing Street memo, either Piers or Nafeez will correct me on this, which I think it was Manning, who was very senior in the Joint Intelligence Committee at the time, who said that we must build our case around, or build intelligence around the case rather than the other way around, which is precisely the reverse of the way things should be with intelligence.
So Nafeez,
intelligence was sexed up.
So, Nafeez, where did the fault lie then in the initial intelligence and the presentation of it? Did it lie with the intelligence chiefs at MI6, or did it lie further down the chain, if you like, once it got into the Prime Minister's office, into number 10?
What seems to me clear, and I think many other historians and academics have argued this quite compellingly, is that there were a number of political officials, including Blair himself, but not just Tony Blair. There was a whole establishment behind him that had already made this pre-made decision. It was a joint Anglo-American decision that they needed to go to war, and that this was the right thing to do. That justification was not related to the intelligence. They didn't have intelligence on WMD at the time. And many sources within the intelligence community now have come on the record and said that they were under huge political pressure to produce intelligence that would fit that narrative that Saddam Hussein is a threat. And all of the abundant information that was actually disproving that was put to the side. And various people in MI5 and MI6, people who are linked to the CIA, people inside the Joint Intelligence Committee as well, have spoken about how there was a real effort to cherry-pick information in order to fit that narrative that Saddam Hussein was a threat, because that was the narrative that they wanted. And this is really gets to the crux of the issue, which I think so far, I mean, we have to actually look deeper into the report, but so far, in what Sir Chilcot has said about the findings, this doesn't seem to have come to light so much, the extent to which there were deliberate efforts to hijack the intelligence community, to pressurize it, to create this politicized narrative about Saddam that was actually false, and that the people who were pushing for it knew that it might well be false, but that wasn't a concern to them.
And Piers, is this a consequence, would you say, of the particular relationship between Tony Blair and George Bush? In the report, and I'm sure that we'll enjoy reading through these memos that have been declassified, we'll get a glimpse of the communications from number 10 to the White House, not the other way around, sadly. But is it a consequence of the specific relationship between the two men?
I'm one of those who thinks that you can exaggerate, in a sense, Tony Blair's role in this particular case. I think Iraq is an extreme case, and I think that the relationship between Tony Blair and President Bush meant that it was particularly acute in terms of this kind of interplay between America and Britain and the build-up of intelligence and the manipulation of intelligence and so on. But I am wondering if any other British Prime Minister would have made vastly different decisions. I think that in the case of Iraq, what you have here, you actually have a bigger picture going on here, and going back to this question of intelligence, a bigger question about the role of the intelligence services in the West, the way in which information is manipulated, not just in the context of Iraq, but across the board in terms of foreign policy. Intelligence services are so caught up with political processes and political objectives that they're not really performing their job which they're supposed to do, which is warn ministers, etc., of threats posed to the country. They become part of projection of power, they become part of foreign policy formulation, and so on and so forth. And I think those processes, and that's the worrying thing today, is that those processes are probably still in play, that just because Tony Blair isn't in power and just because there isn't this sort of particular relationship that we see between Tony Blair and George Bush, I think these processes are still at play, and we still have many of the problems that we had with Iraq are probably playing out today.
Well, that's very alarming. That's a very alarming
policy.
point. Let's put that to Frank, because of course your background is military intelligence as well. Is that what you believe? Do you agree with Piers that the relationship, one of the intelligence services being almost cowed to the politicians, is that still in existence today? And could we see another Iraq fiasco?
I've never been a civilian intelligence officer. My work was concerned with military intelligence, which in the UK is a very different thing. What I would say, though, with respect to state authorities being excessively keen to get involved in things such as this, let's put it that way for simplicity's sake, is that the military were just as complicit and just as culpable in this respect. One of the senior civil servants of the MOD asked military chiefs, were they able to conduct 2 concurrent operations? Remember, there was something else going on in Afghanistan at the time. And he was told by the military, yes, we can do it. Tony Blair himself said that the military leaders, our generals, were up for doing it, the Iraq invasion. Now, that is no way for professional military or expert advisors in any field to behave, let alone military ones where lives are at stake in their thousands in this case.
Now, Nafeez, Tony Blair, in a very lengthy rebuttal or explanation, if you like, to the report, has said that he thought that the human cost of inaction would be much higher for both us, meaning the UK, and indeed the world. Do you buy that?
I mean, I think this kind of counterfactual exercise is something that it's a convenient thing to do in hindsight, but the reality is that before the war, all of the forecasts of the consequence of the war, many of them were done by our own government, by the US government, were that this would destabilize the region, it would convert Iraq into a recruiting sergeant for terrorism rather than dealing with terrorism. And I think the reality is that in the last more than a decade, we have seen what was once a relatively, I mean, of course, Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, but let's not forget the fact that we created him. He was a consequence, in part, of a long-term US, British, and Western European strategy in that region. We armed him. We allowed him to do what he was doing. And then, you know, when we were fed up with his destabilizing policies, we thought, let's get rid of him. But the result of getting rid of him was we completely destabilized the entire region. And we're living with this consequence now. There is absolutely no doubt that whatever the case, the region at the time did not look in any way near to what it looks now, where we have this spillover effect, where not only do we have effectively a failing state in Iraq.
Yeah, but it wasn't all sweetness and light, was it? You'd had Saddam going into Kuwait not that long before. You'd had an 8-10-year war between Iran and Iraq, and of course, as you alluded to, I mean, Saddam himself had been gassing the Kurds, not to mention brutally putting down the Shia Arabs in the south of the country.
Well, as I've mentioned, all of those events that you have just described were undertaken under the nose, under the tutelage of the British and the Americans, and this is a historical fact. So for us to be able to turn around and say that those things, for us to have stopped those horrifying things from happening, we need to go there and intervene. Well, the question is, we were already there. We were there. We were pushing Saddam along with we were arming Saddam while he was fighting the Iranians. And we were egging that war along. We were the ones that supplied the equipment that he used in order to gas the Kurds and the Shiites.
Indeed.
This is very well documented. And I think the question that really needs to be brought back is we should, rather than using these historical atrocities as a stick by which to beat each other and justify a policy which is a clear failure, that really this requires much more soul-searching about the abject failure of British policy in the region over decades, which has culminated in the complete destabilization of the region and the emergence for the first time in history of a so-called Islamic state, which is essentially a terror state, which we'd never seen before the like of this thing.
All right, can I ask Piers about that? Piers, are you making a direct connection between the US-led invasion of 2003 and what we see today? More than 180,000 Iraqi civilians having been killed since that time, and as Nafeez has just referred to, the growing instability being sowed for the most part by ISIL, Islamic State, Daesh, whatever you want to call them.
Well, quite clearly, Iraqi and decisions by people within the region have been important since the invasion of Iraq. But it's incredulous to imagine or to understand the current situation as being disconnected from the original invasion of Iraq. What we seem to have, and as the years go by, more evidence seems to come into play to support this. We have a rolling strategy and engagement in the Middle East, which looks like a broader power struggle between possibly China and Russia, and combining Iran within the region. And this is the conflict which is playing out, and the idea that the actions in Iraq are just disconnected from what's going on now simply doesn't stand up to the empirical evidence which we have available to us. So I think it's impossible to disconnect the two. For sure, there are specific decisions made by actors within the region, and there is responsibility held accordingly for what we see now in the Middle East. But clearly, none of this, we wouldn't have got to where we are today if it hadn't been for the invasion of Iraq back in 2003 and the ensuing chaos within that country.
Frank, I see you nodding your head.
Yes, I used to be a criminal barrister, and you don't get away with an arson charge, which is to say the criminal setting of a fire, by claiming that the house that you set fire to is full of flammable materials. It was full of flammable materials, but we set fire to it. When we got there in 2003, I remember that there was a great fuss about a supposed al-Qaeda group called Ansar al-Islam, who, by the way, were in any way based in the Kurdish region of Iraq, which was effectively under our de facto protection. But that notwithstanding, aside from them, on the territory of Iraq, there were no al-Qaeda presences at all. I don't think I need to say any more.
All right.
With respect to that particular topic.
OK, Nafeez, it's been suggested that the whole Iraq affair has led to a breakdown of trust in politics in the UK. Would you agree with that?
I think there has been a massive breakdown of trust as a consequence of the way, of which, not just the way in which the government has gone to war, but I think the result in terms of the way in which Tony Blair and those around him in government at the time so much struggled to deflect any accountability for what they had actually done. And that's something which I think has carried through after Blair in relation to, Piers was mentioning the fact that a lot of the systems that were in place that were functioning under Tony Blair at the time, which he used in order to manipulate intelligence or whatever the case may be, continue to exist today. Within the way the Foreign Office works, for example, within the way the Cabinet Office works, these systems still exist. And in some cases, they may continue to allow politicians to have that level of unaccountable control, again, using the instruments of the state in order to continue this form of great power struggle, and not just a struggle abroad, but also the politicking that happens inside the bureaucracy of government. And unfortunately, it has a consequence. And now what we're seeing is that the people are aware of this. They're becoming more and more aware of the abject failure. And it gets to a point where whether or not you think that there was a deliberation, that there was intentional decisions that were made for which people should be held to account or not.
I have to jump in there. I'm so sorry, Nafeez.
Sure.
I have to jump in because our time has run out. Can I thank you all? Nafeez, Ahmed, Piers Robinson and Frank Ledwidge. Thank you all. And as ever, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime you like on the website, aljazeera.com. For more discussion, should you want it, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And there's the Twitter sphere. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.